Should pale death with treble dread make the ocean caves our bed, God, who hears the surges roll, deign to save our suppliant soul. To 4 weeks.
In 1801, a lighthouse which had stood there since 1775 was home to a tragedy that would go on to reform lighthouse keeper policy, where one of the 2 wickies stationed there lost his life after suffering for weeks on end following injuries sustained from a freak accident. The 2 men were never known to get along, and out of fear that if he threw the corpse into the ocean he would be accused of murdering the other, the surviving wickie decided to build a coffin and place it on a shelf on the outside of the keeper's hut, but the strong weather of the Welsh oceanside broke the makeshift coffin, causing the dead man's arm to dangle in front of the window in the keeper's hut, and when the winds would blow, it would appear to the isolated man that the arm was beckoning to him, and he had to man the station on his own while dealing with this haunting image until he was relieved by the next set of wickies, and by all accounts, the experience made him nearly unrecognizable to those who knew him. Following the incident, policy was changed to make it so that 3 wickies would be appointed at the same time instead of 2. Max Eggers had been working on an adaptation of an unfinished short story written by Edgar Allan Poe, which he'd begun near the end of his life. It was never finished, but it was about a sole lightkeeper and his dog, told through the perspective of entries in his keeper's log, and it seemed to hint of some ghostly secret in the walls of the tower itself and the eerie waves of the ocean outside, but Poe died before anything could be expanded on. Max was struggling to find a way to bring his screenplay to completion, and when he and his brother Robert were having dinner one night, he talked about the idea he'd been working with. Robert was in a discouraged spot with his prospects in the film industry at the time, having recently been rejected for funding on his first film, The Witch, and he was immediately drawn in by Max's idea of a ghost story in a lighthouse, and so the 2 began developing the story together, pulling from maritime folklore, Greek mythology, and the insanity of isolation. During his research, Robert read about the Smalls lighthouse tragedy and found a lot of potential for the exploration of identity when he found that both men were named Thomas. The brothers completed the screenplay after a hiatus while Robert was working on The Witch, and its massive success gave him a lot more betting chips when it came to what he would do next, making funding the lighthouse a much easier venture than his first feature.
Boredom makes men to villains, and the water goes quick, lad. Vanished.
The Lighthouse, released in 2019 and was Robert Eggers' second feature-length film, proving once again the value that his commitment to research, historical accuracy, and stunning artistry, both in his cinematographic collaboration with Jaron Blaschke, as well as the Shakespearean writing and dialogue, which results in an incredibly dreamy and immersive film. While The Witch was shot digitally for budgetary reasons, The Lighthouse had a budget that allowed Eggers to go about production in his preferred way by shooting on film. Cinematographer Jaron Blaschke had to fight a bit with the studio to let them shoot the film in black and white and in such an unorthodox aspect ratio, as there were concerns about this decision negatively impacting the commercial appeal, but they eventually allowed it to happen. While the film takes place off the coast of Maine, it was in Cape Forshue where the 70-foot lighthouse the film would take place in was built by the local Nova Scotian crew, which was a hell of a time getting through considering how brutal the weather in the Maritimes can be, and that's especially so since they were constructing it in the winter and they're right on the water. In my humble opinion, this is one of the most eternally fascinating movies ever made. The slow descent into Lovecraftian horror and bewildering insanity, partnered with an incredibly distinct visual style and 2 of the greatest performances you'll ever see, is one of the most unique and compelling experiences out there, and despite having seen it numerous times since its release, I find myself completely recontextualizing the story with every little detail that I may have missed or failed to connect on a previous viewing. It's right up there with my favorite movies of all time, and while I love all of Eggers' work and my preference moment to moment is very mood dependent, The Lighthouse is the movie that I find the most fascinating, and it may be the shortest I think it's time for another viewing cycle that I'm on for any movie, like ever. So with that in mind, let's take a look at Robert Eggers' 2019 film, The Lighthouse. By the way, there are chapters in this video just because it's going to be a very long one, so if there's any particular portion you want to hear about, make sure to make use of those.
How long have we been on this rock? 5 weeks? 2 days? Where are we? Help me to recollect.
This is a really difficult movie to talk about since it's so bizarre and so much of what happens is open to interpretation. So I figure before we get too much into the narrative side of things, I'm going to talk about the style and tone since that's such a huge focal point for Eggers. Hell, he even said that the first thing that comes to mind for him when a story is born is a tone or a setting, and then he builds a story out around that atmosphere, so it seems a rather fitting way to approach a discussion about his work. As with The Witch, Eggers and his cinematographer Jaron Blaschke shot in a taller aspect ratio than what most films would be. The initial plan was to film in the same 1:66:1 ratio that The Witch had been, but after Blaschke slyly joked about them going for the 1:19:1 ratio that was common during the time when films were transitioning into using sound, and I have a very strong feeling that Blaschke knew exactly what he was doing when he made that joke, because they agreed that it would be the best fit for the movie's tone and setting. Taller aspect ratios can help to emphasize feelings of claustrophobia and also do a better job at capturing height, both of which are important for this film as the isolation of these two men is the focus of the story, and we also have this 70-foot lighthouse towering over them the whole time, and going with this nearly square aspect ratio really helps to make those two core elements feel as potent as they possibly can. Blaschke and Eggers are both sticklers for authenticity, both in terms of the sets, costume design, and language, but also in terms of the equipment they use to shoot these stories. So, The Lighthouse was shot using Eastman XX5 222 black and white film stock, which was introduced back in 1959, and the idea was to try and reflect the visual style of orthochromatic film. While this film stock definitely gave the sort of look Blaschke wanted, the downside of it is its light sensitivity, which is much lower than a lot of other film stocks, and meant that in order to properly light these scenes with the right contrast, the amount of on-set lighting that was required was so intense that people were wearing sunglasses on set, and during the scenes when Dafoe and Pattinson are sitting at a table, they often couldn't see each other because they were blinded by this 600-watt halogen light used for the lamp between them. Multiple old-fashioned lenses from the early 1900s and the 1930s were used, some of which were strange leftovers Panasonic dug up and thought Blaschke might want, which sounds like the happiest day in the life of an antique film gear nerd like him. And they also used filters to remove the red wavelengths from reaching the camera lens, which darkens any reds that would otherwise pick up just fine, and having two pale white dudes on a seaside in Nova Scotia is gonna make them have a hell of a lot of red on their faces, which is what gives them this weathered look. Another effect of these filters is that the blues get brightened, so even on days when the sky was blue and nice on set, it picks up completely blown out and white in the final product, making the sky itself feel so bleak, like dead beechwood washed up on the shoreside. That sort of color filtering was used in a really cool dynamic way at the end of the movie when Young finally reaches the light, where they had a cyan filter over the light to make the blood on his face look inky black, and then swapped it out for a red one to make the blood look like it's fading away while they turned the brightness on it all the way up. It's a psychotic moment that we'll talk about more later, but for now, I just wanted to mention how great that effect is. We can talk all day about the technicalities behind how the film's look was achieved, but I'm gonna try and avoid doing that so I don't make the most indulgent video I'll ever make. The result of all this thought put into the film's style is nothing less than stunning, both because of the overall look of the movie thanks to the gear and lighting effects that were used, but also because of the painting-like composition of the film's photography. I mentioned in my video about The Witch that the style of that film really reminded me of Andrew Wyeth's paintings, so imagine my excitement when Eggers name-dropped Wyeth as an inspiration for the visuals in The Lighthouse in the director's commentary. That inspiration from paintings isn't something that's simply a stylistic thing. The Sasha Schneider painting Hypnosis is very clearly recreated here, which is directly tied into one of the film's themes of repressed affection between men, since Schneider was a gay man and had to hide that considering he was born in 1870. There are countless images in this movie that look like old orthochromatic photos or charcoal drawings, like something you'd see hung up in an old fishing gear shop on the coast. I will fully admit that a huge reason I find the look and feel of this movie so compelling is because the landscape and architecture are very homey to me as someone who grew up in the Maritimes, so seeing seagulls fly around these old volcanic rocks and looking at the chipped white paint of these buildings is something that makes me feel warm and cozy. But hey, the whole movie feels very surreal, but the way that they went about capturing the scenes that lean even further into that dreamy and strange feeling is incredible, with moments like when Young is drawn into the ocean by the logs calling back to something from his backstory, having such an insanely potent sense of surreality, with the strong flickering moonlight on the inky black ocean waves, and then the insanely unsettling first look at the siren lurking in the water. It's so eerie. My collar really does not want to stay down, does it? I've had to flip this back up about 10 times. There's something very specific about the feeling of being tucked away on a rock far off in the ocean in these old buildings with the rain coming down on an oppressively dark night, the wind blowing through the air and bringing about creaks in the building. That looming sense of something strange lurking in the ocean just outside, completely unknowable and silent but sure in its presence. It's absolutely gripping. The scenes where they share dinner together with the kerosene lantern between them, casting these massive and harsh shadows through the room, the isolation and lack of score in these scenes makes their voices seem so much more booming and strange, and much like these men find the burning light at the top of the tower utterly enchanting, I feel the same about the atmosphere built up in the film. It's one of those movies where if I'm gonna watch it, I always make sure that it's at night with the lights off, with nothing around to distract me, and preferably on a stormy night. The use of visual storytelling is also incredibly well handled here, like for example when the axe in the table is stuck right above Old's head as a little bit of foreshadowing for what's going to happen the following morning. Another incredibly important element of the film's tone is the sound design, which does such a fantastic job of sucking you into the isolated discomfort that these two wickies exist within. The steady hum of seagulls and ocean waves crashing on the rocks, the creaking of the buildings, and of course, throughout the entire movie, there is the constant reminder of the light hanging up there at the top of the tower as the foghorn blares out across the sea. After a while, you almost stop noticing it, and it helps to guide you into a near trance-like state, once again bringing to mind Sasha Schneider's painting titled Hypnosis. With all of that being said, I find it fascinating that perhaps the most memorable moment of the sound design is when it all falls away for a moment. After Young's confession about what happened before he came here, the rain fades to silence, the foghorn ceases to blare for the first time in the movie, and it feels like a massive turning point thanks to the suffocating moment of silence as we get these ethereal shots of the walk to the light before we hear the disembodied voice of Old break the quiet.
Watch us spill your beans.
Mark Corvin returned after doing the score for The Witch, once again bringing along his trusty and oh so coveted by yours truly apprehension engine. I know you can buy them, they're just crazy expensive, and I may try and just make one someday. The Witch featured a very string-heavy score which fit the tone and folklore of the film very well, and this time around there's much more of a focus on brass, heavy percussion, and the use of conch shells to evoke the ancient Greek mythology of the film's story. Corvin is clearly very good at understanding how to write a score that reflects not only the tone of the film, but the setting as well, with his soundtrack here nearly feeling like the swell of the great waves in the sea at night. Strings are still used, but with more of an emphasis on cellos for the low end and foreboding sound. It's not just weird experimental sounds, to be clear, as part of what they wound up wanting to do was to try and make the score reminiscent of old school composition to match the movie's overall style, but with a more dreamy and strange wrapping for the whole thing. Corvin's scores are absolutely fantastic, and I'm very glad that he returned to do the music for this movie, as what he delivered is probably the most complimentary thing we could have asked for, perfectly capturing the strange and dark ethereal tone of the movie with deep roots of deception, disorientation, and isolation. It's incredible stuff. One of the things that I love so much about Eggers' films is how he goes about writing dialogue, with a lot of what we hear in The Witch being taken directly from period-relevant texts.
Must I hear the devil wag his tongue in thy mouth?
There is less of that one-to-one writing here, with the only thing close to that being the toast that Wake gives throughout the movie.
Should pale death with treble dread make the ocean caves our bed, God who hears the surges roll, deign to save the suppliant soul.
That was inspired by the poem Sailor's Hymn at Parting by Lydia Sigourney, very closely resembling the final few lines of her writing, but being altered to fit the film's story better. Aside from that, the film's dialogue is more so a product of the Eggers brothers getting quite comfortable with Shakespearean writing and knowing how to translate their stories into that sort of presentation. The most important source of research for the regional writing here was brought up by Eggers' wife, who discovered an author named Sarah Ornay Jewett. Jewett's focus on telling stories taking place in coastal Maine was a phenomenal resource for this film because of how she would interview locals in the region at the time and record direct directly what they said, which gave a lot of information to the Eggers about the specific dialect that would have been used during the period the story takes place in.
I'll find some chark in ye, lad. Now's the time for gab and chatter.
Using their knowledge of Shakespearean writing as well as the interviews from Jewett's research, the dialogue crafted for this film is absolutely nothing less than astounding poetry.
Smell like jism, like rotten dick, like curdled foreskin.
I said what I said. I could watch Dafoe and Pattinson sit at a table and converse in these characters forever. It's such evocative writing with very strong imagery. There are lines in this movie that I regularly quote. The insults are perfection as well, and I've incorporated a few of them into my lexicon.
You're a goddamn drunken, horse-shitting, short shit liar.
There's a lot going on in The Lighthouse, as you can tell by the fact that I haven't even talked about the story yet, and a lot of what happens is very symbolic and weird and hard to wrap your head around, and I think that the discussions around the film's meaning and whether or not it has any merit have overshadowed what I think is one of its best qualities. The Lighthouse is fucking hilarious.
A bloody steak. If I had a steak, I would fuck it.
In the director's commentary that Eggers did, he talked about how if he was gonna follow up The Witch, which was a very bleak and miserable movie, with another story about misery, he wanted to be able to laugh at it. So, fart jokes. That's almost verbatim, by the way. There are a lot of farts in this movie, and while I'm sure to some degree it's a way to show how old is asserting dominance over young, from the sounds of it, they're really just there to try and lighten things up a bit and add to the bizarre confusion of the movie's tone. This mixing of a very dark and serious mythological story about salvation and divine ascension with juvenile humor like that actually does help the overall story, since so much of it is meant to be disorienting and strange, so having those two tones present scene to scene makes it very hard to really know what you're meant to be feeling, but it doesn't feel dissonant or out of place at all. Part of why I love this movie so much is because of how much goddamn fun it is to watch these two characters interact.
Feel shame when you lie with a woman.
I ain't saying to nothing.
I will never not be beaming like a child on Christmas morning while watching Old get upset about Young saying he doesn't like his cooking, and then in response, Old goes into the most dramatic monologue you'll ever see, cursing Young with the spirits of the sea and the Greek gods.
For any stuff or part of Winslow, even any scantling of your soul, is Winslow no more.
It's one of my favorite scenes in all of film, and it's wildly impressive that Dafoe did this entire monologue in one long take without blinking a single time. They do cut away from it for a moment to show Young's reaction, but what we see is a full one-shot of Dafoe doing the whole thing.
All right, have it your way. I like your cooking. Randomly
yelling, "Hark!" has become a staple of my household because of this scene. The dance scene is another one of my favorites, where the two get absolutely fucking hammered and begin singing songs together before Old starts a big exciting jig and tells Young to dance as well with an urgency that is just hilarious.
Dance, Winslow! Dance!
Young is, despite what it may seem, actually singing a real song here and saying words. Robert Pattinson just sang it in the most unhinged possible way, and it absolutely fills me with joy. Well, with all that being said, what the hell actually happens in this movie? It's important to establish when talking about the narrative here that this is not a movie that's meant to be entirely understood. Part of the film's purpose is to be weird and confusing and strange, placing you right in the shoes of someone losing their mind in isolation and becoming delusional. I've never felt much of an urge to try and fully understand everything that happens because not even the actors really knew, and Eggers wouldn't tell them. At one point, Pattinson asked Eggers whose perspective the movie was from, and I'm probably paraphrasing here, but his response was along the lines of, "Who do you think?" If the lead actors aren't even given stable ground to stand on, then I feel like it's safe to assume that this is meant to be a part of the movie. It's also worth noting that Eggers said this movie arguably doesn't even have a narrative, so that just goes further to show the point I'm trying to make. However, having seen the movie so many times, reading through the screenplay, researching some of the mythology that was referenced, and trying to interpret the absolutely incredible visual storytelling, I do have some thoughts, although they all still leave me with questions. It feels like Eggers was intentionally tempting the viewer to try and look deeper into the bizarre happenings in the movie by laying these seeds throughout that start to paint a picture, but then one detail will come up or you'll notice something be recontextualized earlier that doesn't fit in with what you thought was going on. Some viewers want a concrete and definitive answer to the thematic purpose of a film, and I have a feeling that if you feel this way, this movie might really frustrate you because I don't think it's ultimately there beyond whatever connections we personally draw. There's this general underlying story that I feel pretty good about, but it's amazing to me how depending on the angle that I look at the film from, almost every element can mean a different thing. What I'm gonna try and do here is go through the different ideas I have about the narrative and then see if there's a way that they can all coexist. The basis of the story is quite simple. We open on this amazing and foreboding shot of two wickies arriving to the lighthouse where they are to be stationed for the next 4 weeks. They don't know each other, but the older one has been working this lighthouse for a long time, and the younger one is fresh on the job. The screenplay only ever refers to them as old and young, outside of when they say each other's names in dialogue, and this approach to their names makes it very clear that we just have no idea what the hell is going on. One of the most important things that's established about Young almost right away is that he wants to try and gain access to things and be given privileges that he hasn't yet earned. The moment he walks inside, he tries to get into Old's locked desk, knowing that he's not meant to be snooping around there, and yet it takes him no time at all to try anyway, almost as if he feels like he's entitled to whatever is inside of it. That's important to set up right off the bat because throughout the movie, Young tries to get his way into the lighthouse itself, which Old is holding steadfast that it is his post and Young is a long ways away from being up there.
I'm the keeper of this station, lad. Some other station you can tend the light.
And whether it be the forbidden nature of it, sheer curiosity, or something else entirely, Young is absolutely locked on wanting to get up into the light itself. There are these little details like him leaving his cigarettes below the ladder into the light, almost like he's trying to claim the space for his own in some strange way that not even he realizes since he forgets them and has to go back to retrieve them at night. So I suppose it's important to try and look into what compels him so strongly to the light, and this is one of the simpler things to answer because it fits whether you look at the film from a supernatural perspective or from the point of view that we're just watching a descent into madness. The key lies very simply in how Old's last second described it.
He believed that there was some enchantment in the light. Salvation, said he.
The light sitting up there at the top of the tower represents just that. Salvation. Very early on, we get this shot of Young working down below, and the camera pans up from the dark, dirty, and overwhelmingly loud base of the tower and slowly crawls up the spiraling staircase, winding up eventually at the ethereal light on the top, representing the urge to climb from the depths of hell into the light of heaven. Throughout the film, Young is shown working his way up the tower in one way or another, but never in the ideal manner, like how he lugs this massive kerosene can up the stairs. He winds up having to haul it all the way back down when Old tells him that it's dangerous to have this large can up here, and he's also shown that there are smaller cans meant for this exact situation. This represents how instead of taking the slow, patient, and proper way up, he's trying to force his way through this ascent without the proper care given. Then we have the scene later on when they're whitewashing the tower and Old is being very aggressive with the pulley, which eventually leads to it breaking and Young falls to the ground, once again being sent back down to the bottom from his attempt at ascent. It's worth noting here that they never even finished painting the tower, which makes it seem like Old just wanted to mess with him. It's made very clear as things go on and Young becomes more and more driven to get into the light that he feels very entitled to it, and there's a clear difference between how these two men view the light. Old is very protective, and when we see him up at the top following that shot of hell to heaven, he raises his cup to it.
To ye,
There's a reverence in the way Old sees the light, whereas there's an entitlement from Young who hasn't earned his way up yet, which, as was established earlier when he tried to break into Old's desk, is something that's not unique to this situation. It also ties directly into Young's backstory that gets revealed after a while, where he admits that he's been lying about why he's here and who he is. He first tells Old that his name is Ephraim Winslow, and that he worked for the Hudson Bay Company in Canada but got fed up with it.
Just like you said, I just had enough of trees, I guess.
It's true that he did work for the Hudson Bay, but the reason that he left is much darker than what we know at first. As it turns out, Ephraim Winslow was the name of Young's former, who was having a go at Young one day when he fell into the water, and Young did nothing to save him from drowning.
All I could think when he was done was, I could use me a smoke.
Now, he remains adamant that while he thought about swinging the axe down on his head in his anger, he never actually did that. However, I have a slight feeling that may not actually be the case. I think that most of this is the truth, but it's also hinted at that he did in fact axe Ephraim towards the end of the movie when he does the same to Old, and then all he seems to think is,
I could use me a smoke.
We're seeing this movie through a very unreliable and vague lens, so it's hard to know what's real and what's not, but I do find it interesting how comfortable he was with doing this and that he had the exact same reaction that he described last time. He's also shown to be quite a violent person as things progress, seeming more comfortable with the thought of violent acts than someone who'd never committed one before would likely be, like when he nearly stabs Old in the throat while he sleeps with a knife that he stole and tried to use to break into the light, which broke in the shape of a seagull's bill, by the way. It's pretty cool. He seems to be holding himself together fairly well at first, sticking to his sobriety after admitting that he had a problem with drinking before, but when he eventually gives in and begins drinking again, things go off the rails really quickly, and we see just how unhinged he truly is. Point is, after either killing or negligently allowing him to die, Young took Ephraim's identity and fled the company, finding himself taking up the job as a wickie after learning about the pay and the isolation.
Tends a light far offshore. The further away, the more he earns.
That's another example of how Young has a tendency to force his way into positions or places that he hasn't earned the right to be in yet, taking the identity of his former. All that being said, it's not as clear as Young is bad and Old is good, because Old is a very antagonistic and taunting man who takes pleasure in the displeasure of Young. Not warning him before drinking water from the cistern that's full of shit, messing with him with the pulleys. This kind of thing happens all the time. He's very harsh on him with moments like when he tells him he hasn't cleaned this space despite Young's insistence that he has, which is another one of the best scenes of the movie.
And if I tells you to pull up and apart every floorboard and clapboard of this here house and scour 'em down with your bare bleeding knuckles, you'll do it!
He's very critical of him, and as things descend further into madness, he seems to be taunting Young's shaky grasp on reality. But there's also a lot of moments where the two get along extremely well. It's impressive how well the movie handles this unhinged relationship between the two, where they'll be enjoying drinks and laughing one second, fighting like it's the end of the world the next, then sharing stories of their past while smoking and drinking, then slow dancing together, then beating the shit out of each other. They really go through all of it, and it's a hell of a lot of fun to watch. So here we have Old, a man who's been with this light for a long time and has respect and love for whatever magic is seemingly at the top, and then there's Young, a man who only just got here after killing someone and going on the run, who feels like he should be allowed access to that same magic. You could look at the movie as simply as that. There is something in the light that has kept Old here for a very long time, and he's earned his place at the top to enjoy whatever splendor he sees within it. Young comes here after doing something horrible, and because of his nature, he feels like he should be allowed up there. He sees his salvation and wants to force his way in, and in the process, he gives in to his old temptations of drinking and slowly loses his mind, becoming more and more unhinged and tormented by Old, who sees him for what he is, but also strangely relies on him for companionship. And by the end, Young kills Old and breaks his way into the light. The bizarre imagery can be a result of us seeing the movie through the lens of Jung, who's clearly mentally unstable and can't be seen as reliable when it comes to having an accurate sense of reality. The isolation, alcohol, and consumption of turpentine could have broken whatever shaky grip he had left, and it could be as simple as that. Another way of looking at the movie could be through a sort of cyclical lens, where old and young are the same person. They do, after all, share a name, and there's an interesting detail that seems to fuzzy their characters a little bit during that scene where they're sharing stories together. Throughout the film, Young smokes rolled cigarettes and Old smokes from a pipe, but during this one scene, they swap, and they also happen to be wearing the same clothes here, which leans further into that idea of them being the same person. Could it be that Old is the version of Young who earned his salvation, and Young is the version of him that hasn't done so yet, and is being tormented through his test by his older and wiser self? That may explain why Old is so terrified of Young leaving him, because even though he ascended past the transgressions of his younger self, he's still terrified of the idea of the man he used to be completely leaving him behind on his own. He could be taunting this younger version of himself because he hates the things he did and the temptations he gave into. Maybe Old is the ghost of who Young will be when he eventually manages to transcend, and Young is forced to relive this experience over and over again until he finally earns it. But what the hell's with the tentacles then? What about the Siren and the Scrimshaw? Well, in the screenplay book, there's a section at the back that's full of definitions for different words from the era that we may not know, or for words that relate to the maintenance of the lighthouse that the layman would be unfamiliar with. But one thing that caught my eye is the definitions given for Proteus and Prometheus, two gods from Greek mythology. They are both mentioned in the film, and while I'm very much not well versed in Greek mythology, the connections that these two gods have to Young and Old really help in understanding the movie's story at a deeper level, with something that seems much more concrete despite how symbolic it all is. Proteus is one of Poseidon's children and was said to be the guardian of the first lighthouse, which was called the Lighthouse of Alexandria. He was referred to as the Old Man of the Sea and was known to be a shapeshifter, which lines up pretty much perfectly with Old himself when you take into account the bizarre things that we see occur with him at certain points of the film. Of course, being the keeper of the light is a clear connection as well, as is the use of the simple name Old. So while Old is at the very least meant to reflect Proteus, Young seems to have a lot in common with Prometheus, a titan of Greek mythology who was banished to an eternity of being bound to a rock while an eagle pecked out his liver, which grows back each day only for the torment to resume. And why was he given such a harsh sentence? Because he defied the gods and captured fire, and according to the definition in the book, he represents humans overreaching. The connection here is undeniable, with the final scene of the film depicting Young on a rock with a seagull pecking out his liver in place of an eagle. I was curious as to why the screenplay specified that his liver was being pecked at, and this definition cleared that right up for me. Early on in the film, Old mentions that his former thought that St. Elmo himself had cast his fire into the light, further solidifying that connection that Young has with Prometheus, where he stole the fire he was not meant to touch and was then punished for it eternally. St. Elmo, also known as Erasmus of Formia, is the patron saint of sailors, and St. Elmo's fire is a bizarre light phenomenon which occurs during storms that was the source of many different stories in nautical folklore. However, I definitely wouldn't go so far as to say that this is literally a story about Proteus and Prometheus, since there are elements that separate the events of the film from those stories, like how the bird at the end is swapped from an eagle to a seagull, which means we also have to take into account the connections to nautical and maritime folklore. We even see the blending of these two mythologies towards the end of the movie when Old is being buried. It's one of the most poetic scenes of the film, with Old talking about Protean forms and Promethean plunder, but also referring to Fiddler's Green, a sort of heavenly afterlife for sailors and maritime folklore. The thing is, that angle of Greek mythology doesn't at all negate the previous theories, since at the core of these stories, the natures of the characters themselves remain very similar. Prometheus's hubris led him to try and capture something that wasn't his, as did Young's, and Proteus's stance as this old god of the sea can coexist with Old being the keeper of the light or some ghost who calls this rock home. The other two pieces of the puzzle are the Siren and the One Eyed Seagull, who plays a very important part in the events of the film. The Siren, at least in my eyes, represents temptation, which is something that Young is forced to confront constantly in the film, be it the draw he has to alcohol, sexuality, or the light. The image of the siren on the rock was the first thing to come to Robert's mind when his brother Max told him about the movie he was making, and so it's certainly a core part of what he tried to bring to the script. In folklore, sirens lull people into the oceans with their eerie songs, and then pull them into the depths once they have them under their spell. To my chagrin, there is no eerie siren song floating across the ocean waves in this movie, but instead we have the siren tempting Young sexually. When he first arrives, he finds a mermaid scrimshaw tucked away in the mattress and becomes obsessed with it as time goes on. The scrimshaw looks to have belonged to the last second, implying a similar tendency towards depraved sexual behavior. He begins to see this siren, appearing first after he hallucinates the death of his former back in Canada, which almost makes it feel like the sight and horrifying shriek that come from the creature are a reminder to him of the dark secret that he's keeping locked away in the deep ocean of his mind. It's also not out of the question that Old and the siren are connected, considering the parallels between him and Proteus and the fact that Proteus can shapeshift in mythology. So we have this idol of temptation that Young is both drawn to and deeply terrified of, like any sane man would be at the thought of falling back into the vices that led him down a dark road. The One Eyed Seagull is fascinating as well and is directly tied to Old's previous second. When Young finds the head of the deceased man, we see that it only has one eye, and earlier on in the movie, Old had warned Young about how the souls of dead sailors found their homes in the gulls.
Why is it bad luck to kill a gull?
In 'em's the souls of sailors, what met their maker.
The one-eyed bird taunts and torments Young throughout the first act of the film, which may be somewhat of a reference to how the hand of the wickie that died in the Smalls Lighthouse tragedy would tap against the window of the surviving man, driving him slowly mad. Young kills the gull in a moment of sheer rage, which beckons in the massive storm that makes things so much worse as Young has now committed an atrocious sin. That section in and of itself seems fairly simple, where we have this piece of maritime folklore about seagulls harboring the souls of dead sailors, and the act of violently destroying that vessel causes this storm to explode. But then we see the one-eyed seagull again at the end of the movie, pecking away at Young's liver, which brings up a bunch of new questions. Was the gull something more than what it seemed to be at first, and was it in fact part of the test that Young was being put up to as a part of his salvation to see if he could resist against his tendencies towards violence, and then when he wasn't, the gull was ultimately part of his punishment as well? Could it be that a lot of the Greek mythology that we see is nothing more than hallucinations on the part of Young, who perhaps knew some of these stories, and then as his grip on reality loosened during the storm, his mind began to fill in blanks to try and find something to grasp onto, and because he hated that gull so much, he saw it as the perpetrator of his eternal torment? Is the whole story happening inside of his head as he sits there on the rock with his liver being pecked out for all eternity, and the gull manifested in that hallucination as his tormentor, as if it was reality, if you could call it that? Another idea relating to that gull is that we know that Old's last second developed a similar obsession with the light to the one that Young does, and while Young won his fight against Old, it may have gone down differently last time. That would also explain why Old has such a visceral reaction to Young getting aggressive with the one-eyed seagull, because not only is he trying to hammer in the idea of the spirits of sailors who died at the sea coming back as seagulls, and killing one would be a disrespect to them, there's also this strange shame that he shows during this scene.
I mean no mind, lad. None.
He may think that the seagull is the resurrection of his last second and feels ashamed of what he did and doesn't want his spirit to be further harmed.
Best leave him be. Bad luck to kill a seabird.
There are more connections here to the Smalls Lighthouse tragedy, where if this theory of Old having actually killed his second after he too became obsessed with the light is true, there's a parallel there of how the surviving man put the deceased into a coffin to try and avoid being charged for murder, while Old may have thrown the head into the water in the hope that it would be washed away into the sea. Maybe the head is all that's left of what has already been taken. Maybe all of these seagulls here are previous seconds that have been all tested by Old. Who the hell knows? Going back to that painting that's recreated, it was done by a gay man who, because of the time he was alive for, was often forced to hide that. There's no question that Young and Old have affection for one another. They dance together and hold on to each other like they're all they have, and at one point it looks like they come damn close to kissing before they begin beating the shit out of each other. Men tend to have a harder time being affectionate with each other, even if the intentions are completely platonic, which I don't think you can easily say they are here. And through moments like that, you can see a reflection of where they get so close to it, but instead they both explode into violence. They sometimes argue like an old married couple, which is honestly where a lot of the fun comes from.
How can I possibly like the horse shit you fix us for supper? You're drunk. You won't be saying that.
So many theories. This movie is so full of symbolism that pulls you into a direction that seems to make sense for the first while, and then something else will come up that forces you to completely reconsider everything you thought you understood about the underlying narrative. As I said at the beginning of this video, I think that's completely intentional. We're being given just enough of multiple different ideas, but not quite enough for any one of them to be definitive, which opens up this whole world of discussion and theorization that I don't think can ever be concluded. Out of the different angles I've talked about here, I'm not even sure which one I like the most, let alone which one I think has the most to it. On my most recent viewing, however, after going through all these different ideas and trying to see what dots I could connect, I realized that from a certain perspective, a lot of these theories are not mutually exclusive. So what I'm going to try and do is give an overall explanation using bits and pieces of everything I've talked about here to try my very best to incorporate the ideas that I find the most interesting. In terms of the histories of these two men, Old tells the most truth about his life. However, by the time that Young arrives at the Rock, Old is a ghost who stayed on the lighthouse because of how much he loved it, and because he's so drawn to the light. Young did kill his former at the Hudson Bay Company with the axe, but he's not someone who can take responsibility for the things he does wrong, and has perhaps even convinced himself that he didn't do it. You can see that attempt to shove back his true identity, not just through him lying about his name, but also in his accent, which changes when he gets drunk, angry, or otherwise unhinged, making it seem like the way he speaks at the beginning of the movie is a facade he's built up, and we see that break down as time goes on.
Can't find a post I can take a real shine to, so I keep moving along.
You ain't the president, you ain't my father. And I'm sick of you acting like you is.
Given the mystical significance of the lighthouse itself, his time as a wickie is essentially used as a test of his character to see if he's worthy of salvation following what he did, and the ghost of Old is a part of that trial. The parallels between Young and Old are there to make Young face the person he really is instead of the identity he's attempted to take on, which is why Old takes the name Thomas. Old does enjoy the company of Young, despite being a part of his trial, because he likely gets quite lonely out here and doesn't get to share his life stories with anyone all that often. Maybe part of why he's so descriptive when telling these stories and why he goes on and on and on for so long is so that he can create imagery in his own head to go along with them, hoping that it will help solidify the memories in his own mind for longer out of fear that they'll fade away if he doesn't give them the care they need or express them properly. The imagery from Greek mythology manifests at times as a sort of cosmic expression of their two archetypes, and it's used to push Young to his limits. The seagull was used to trial his tendencies towards violence, the siren his depraved sexual thoughts, and the light his entitlement, all of which he failed. While he does confess to what happened, he doesn't take responsibility for his role in the death of his former. Whether he killed him with the axe or not, he is still guilty, and he doesn't accept that to a satisfactory degree.
I didn't. I did not.
He sounds like he's trying to convince himself here more than he is Old. The torment gets stronger and stronger, eventually breaking his sanity as he fully gives into the temptations he tried to fight against, resorting to drinking thieves' oil, a mixture of turpentine and honey. He shows time and time again, following his transgression against the spirit in the seagull, that he is a violent and unhinged person who feels entitled to the beauty he believes to be in the light. You could even put in the time loop theory and have Old be the ghost of who Young would be when he transcended, here to test the real him. Notice anything about what I'm saying here? It's an absolute incoherent mess. Sure, there are things that seem to make sense there, but there are also a lot of things that aren't clearly answered or get brought into question when taking into account other elements of the film that I didn't mention, and that's pretty much the idea here. For example, I said that Old is pretty honest with his backstory, but there's this huge inconsistency with the story he gives about what happened to his leg.
I thought you said you broke it.
Hey,
The leg.
you must have misheard.
It's futile to try and come to any concrete conclusions about the meaning and symbolism of the film. The only theory in my eyes you can say isn't left with a bunch of holes or contradictions is that we see the film through the lens of Young, who's extremely mentally unstable, and all the insane things we see are just delusions. These two are really just flesh and blood human beings, and through isolation and falling back into old temptations, one of them completely loses his mind. Maybe Old was right about Young still being up in Canada, walking through the snow and talking to himself like a lunatic.
I'm probably a figment of your imagination. This rock is a figment of your imagination too.
That one can also pretty much explain it all, since all of the hard-to-grasp elements can be explained away as insanity. That's a perfectly valid way to look at the movie, but when you go beyond that and start taking some of the symbolism more literally, I think you lose any chance of finding a definitive answer almost anywhere, and that's one of the main appeals for me. That scene where Old is asking all of these questions to Young is easily one of the best in the movie, because at least in that moment, Young is the audience stand-in. We just watched Old chase Young with an axe and smash the boat up, but when we get back inside and the axe goes in the table, the camera pans from one room to the other, and when that happens, we've now lost the ability to actually know where anything stands, and Old immediately calls into question the things we literally just watched.
And I knew ye was mad when you smashed up that lifeboat just now and chasing me with an axe trying to kill old Tom.
Is he messing with Young? Is he telling the truth? We just don't know, and he may as well be talking directly to us here, as he basically says we have no idea what's happening and we shouldn't even bother trying. The ending of the movie is the most clear to me, where after killing Old, Young climbs to the top of the tower, covered in blood and dirt and out of his mind, clearly representative of how poorly he managed his way up here, and he finally gets to face the light that he's so coveted since his arrival. But when he does, his reaction is that of sheer terror. He's utterly incapable of processing the fear of what he sees in the light, as is made clear in the screenplay. The first time I saw the movie, I thought that he was laughing here, but that's not the case. Whatever he's shown in the light brings to him more terror than man is capable of feeling, and he falls back down the tower once more before awakening in this mythological image that doesn't even do us the courtesy of zooming out far enough to show the buildings on the rock, further calling into question everything we just watched. The salvation angle is the thing that's the most clear to me here, with how hard-headed and entitled Young has been the whole movie, and then being broken by terror when he's shown whatever is in there, like he's seeing the eternity he's cursed himself to by trying to force his way into the light. Old's final speech that he gives while being buried leans into this, and I want to take a moment to analyze what's actually being said here.
Oh, what protean forms swim up from men's minds and melt in hot Promethean plunder.
Protean means something that can change forms or is otherwise versatile, which could be referring to the ways that Young managed to convince himself of his innocence and find a way to tell himself that he's worthy of salvation. His identity is unstable, shifting throughout the movie as he tries to hide himself from the reality of who he is. Plunder essentially means to steal, so Promethean plunder simply means fire, as it was the thing that was stolen by Prometheus. We see that fire scorching Young's eyes at the end of the movie, and when we see him on the rock, there are these burned out voids in his head. Perhaps this is the same thing that happened with Old's last second, which would explain his missing eye and why the seagull only has one as well. Maybe the shame that we saw earlier was because Old felt bad that his last second didn't find his salvation, or maybe we're not seeing shame here at all, but instead simply fear.
Scorching eyes with divine shames and horror, and casting them down to Davy Jones.
Both men were cast down to Davy Jones, the devil in maritime folklore, and his locker is essentially hell, which was often seen as the infinite abyss of the ocean where the last second's head was found.
The others, the Fiddler's Green sent where no man is suffered. To want or toil.
Fiddler's Green, as I said earlier, is, for the sake of discussion, heaven. So while some see the fire and their eyes are scorched out as they're shown the shame and horror of the people they are before they're thrown to Davy Jones, the ones who earned the light, while still blinded by its brilliance, find themselves in Fiddler's Green to live on for all eternity.
Beautiful and unchanging as the shade who girdles round the globe.
A girdle is a type of undergarment that wraps around the torso, so she who girdles round the globe would be the ocean itself, which Old likens to the unchanging form of those who find themselves in Fiddler's Green. The Lighthouse. Good God. I feel like at some point I need to just force myself to stop and try and wrap this up, because I think I could just go on for hours and hours theorizing about what happens here, and still come to no strong conclusions, of course. Robert and Max Eggers crafted one of the most endlessly fascinating, entertaining, and batshit insane movies I have ever had the pleasure of experiencing. It's also one of the most rewatchable movies out there because of how many different breadcrumbs there are to pick up on, and I haven't even talked about all of them here. There's so many more little details in this movie, and I'm positive that there are even more I haven't picked up on yet, and maybe I never will. But it's all part of the fun. As far as I'm concerned, The Lighthouse is a perfect movie. There is absolutely nothing that I would change here and nothing that I view as a negative, which is very rare for me. The performances are Oscar-worthy, as is the cinematography, costume, and set design. The writing is poetic and evocative, and the story itself is an endless canvas for thought experiments designed to torment you for seeking out answers. Atmospheric, hilarious, disorienting, fascinating perfection. Thanks for watching through to the end. I hope you enjoyed the video enough that you want to see more, and if that's the case, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell because YouTube can sometimes suck at recommending channels. A huge thank you to my wonderful Patreon supporters and YouTube channel members who are a massive help in allowing me to continue committing as much time as I can to making these videos. If you want to gain access to things like behind the scenes material or gain early access to my videos, consider supporting me on either platform. As always, thank you for stopping by Rocklin Graves. I hope you've enjoyed your stay.